The gallows creaked in the soft wind that moved down from the hills, brushing dust across the boardwalk and swirling it around the boots of men who had come not for justice, but for spectacle. By the steps of the courthouse, a girl no taller than 5 feet stood shaking in her pale wedding dress, its hem caked in dry mud, her wrists already marked red from the sheriff's grip. She wasn't from here. No one knew her name when she showed up 3 weeks ago with a marriage certificate, a promise in her eyes, and a ring too loose on her finger. Now they called her a liar, a thief, and something worse, though no one had proved anything. The judge's voice echoed across the town square as he read the charges, but few listened. They just stared at her, small and trembling, trying not to cry. Behind the crowd, leaning against the post of the old blacksmith shop, a man larger than any other stood in silence. His hair was braided down his back, his chest bare beneath a deerskin vest, and his arms the size of a ranch gate's crossbeam. No one had seen him speak since he arrived last fall, with nothing but a sack and a broken horse. Some said he was Lakota, some said Cheyenne, others just called him the Giant. He watched as the sheriff pulled the rope tighter. The bride flinched. Somewhere a child asked if they were going to hurt her. His hand twitched. No one noticed. The judge asked her if she had anything to say. She opened her mouth but couldn't speak. Someone in the crowd shouted, "Send her back where she came from." Another threw a coin at her feet. That's when the giant moved. The boards groaned under his weight as he stepped forward, boots slow but unshakable, parting the crowd without looking left or right. The sheriff turned just as the man reached the gallows, his shadow stretching over the girl like a shield. He didn't say anything at first. He looked at the judge, then the sheriff, then finally down at the bride, who stared at him like she was seeing the sun for the first time. Then he spoke. "I did it," he said, voice deep and slow as Riverstone. "Let her go." The judge blinked. "What?" The giant stepped up onto the gallows beside her. "I did everything you blame her for. Cut her free." The sheriff hesitated, torn between order and disbelief. The bride's mouth moved, but no sound came. All around them, the townsfolk went silent, not because they understood, but because something in the way he stood made them forget how to hate for a moment. The sheriff looked at the judge. The judge looked at the crowd. No one moved, and in the stillness the wind shifted, as if the hills themselves were holding their breath. He wasn't arrested. Not yet. The judge ordered them both held for questioning, but only one set of shackles came out, and they didn't fit the girl's wrists. The Lakota giant bent down calmly, offering his hands like he'd done this before. The sheriff hesitated, then locked the irons, but his voice was quieter now. "You sure about this?" The man didn't answer. The girl looked at him in disbelief, her voice finally returning in a hoarse whisper. Why would you lie?" He glanced at her. Not soft, not cruel, just steady. Sometimes a lie saves more than truth does. As the crowd began to drift, murmurs chasing the wind, he was led inside the jailhouse, head high, footsteps slow, dragging weight not from the cuffs but from something heavier. The girl stood unmoving by the steps until one of the town women, Mrs. Bell, put a shawl over her shoulders and guided her away, muttering something about soup and a bath. Inside the jail, the deputy looked nervous. "I've seen your kind fight off 6 men. You gonna cause trouble?" The giant sat on the floor instead of the cot, resting against the back wall, arms folded. "No trouble unless you bring it." The sheriff rubbed his beard. "You sure you want to carry this?" The man said nothing. The town was small, but its secrets were large. And as the door shut behind the sheriff, the girl sat in a borrowed dress, clean now, but quiet, in the corner of the boarding house kitchen. She hadn't spoken again. Mrs. Bell stirred the stew loudly. No one ever stood up like that before. Not for a stranger. The girl finally whispered, "He doesn't know me. Why would he lie?" Mrs. Bell glanced over. Because sometimes the guilty ones look clean, and the good ones look like him. Meanwhile, back at the jail, the deputy returned holding a faded folder. "Problem is," he muttered, "we already have a report from Abilene about a con scheme matching her description. If you're taking the fall, you'll be on trial by Sunday." The man only said, "Then hang me." The deputy stared. "You're not even going to fight it?" "I've fought too many things. Maybe it's time someone else got to walk free." Outside, a storm brewed, clouds gathering not in the sky, but in the whispers that passed through every dry goods store and saloon table that night. They didn't know the truth. But they knew what they saw. A man twice her size stand between a noose and a girl too small to fight. And sometimes, people remember courage more than facts. That night, she didn't sleep. Not because the bed was strange or because the town still whispered behind shuttered windows, but because the coat he'd taken off before stepping into the sheriff's hands was still in her lap. It was too big, smelled of leather and rain, and she held it like a child might hold a memory. Down the hallway, Mrs. Bell whispered with the preacher's wife about what ought to be done. "If he's innocent, we'll need proof. And if he's not, then the Lord will see it settled one way or another." But the girl, her name was Eliza, kept silent, tracing the stitched seams of the coat's inside pocket where, tucked in careful folds, she found a slip of paper. It wasn't a name or a confession. It was a receipt for a wagon wheel, a sack of oats, and a pair of small leather shoes. Her hand trembled. She didn't know if it meant something, or if it meant everything. At the jailhouse, the Lakota giant said nothing either. He watched the sunrise through bars that caught gold in their rust, and when the sheriff brought him coffee, he nodded once. "You got family?" the sheriff asked, leaning against the doorframe. "Not here." "You think she's worth this?" The man didn't answer. The sheriff didn't press. By midday, the preacher himself came to speak with Eliza. "You're not from here," he said gently. "But this town runs on the truth, not sympathy." Eliza's voice cracked for the first time. "Then why did none of you step in?" The preacher blinked. "We didn't know what we were seeing." "He did." She held up the coat. "And he didn't wait to decide." That afternoon, a boy ran up to the general store and whispered something to the clerk. By sundown, word had spread. A rider had come in from the south, dust-covered, urgent, claiming he recognized the girl, but not the way the town expected. "She's the widow of Jesse Wade," the rider said, "and there's a bounty on her head, not because she lied, but because she wouldn't let a railroad man take what her husband died protecting." The sheriff rubbed his temple. "So what's the truth now?" The rider looked over at the jail. "The truth is, your prisoner's the only one who didn't flinch when the law turned sideways." In the boarding house, Eliza sat at the window, the coat still draped over her knees. When a knock came at the door, she thought it was Mrs. Bell, but it was the preacher's wife, holding a worn Bible in one hand and a clean dress in the other. "If you want them to listen, honey," she said softly, "you'll have to speak." And sometimes, a woman's voice carries farther than a man's fists ever did. The chapel doors hadn't been opened in weeks, but Eliza pushed them wide like she'd been born to walk straight down that aisle, not as a bride, but as a witness. Dust swirled in the air like ghosts of all the vows whispered and broken there, and the pews creaked as townsfolk turned, one by one, to see the girl they'd pitied, now standing taller than any of them expected. Her hair was pulled back, her dress pressed clean, and in her hands, folded like a prayer, was the Lakota man's coat. The preacher paused mid-sermon, but Eliza didn't flinch. "I need to speak," she said. "It can't wait." A ripple went through the room. Women clutched their children, men shifted uncomfortably. The sheriff rose in the back, but no one stopped her. "You all saw him take the blame," she said. "You all saw me cry and him kneel. But none of you know why I ran, or who I was running from." Her voice cracked only once. "My husband died defending our land they said belonged to the rail company. When he refused to sell, they called it defiance. When I stayed behind, they called me property. And when I fled, they called it theft." She unfolded the receipt, held it up. He bought shoes, for a child he didn't even know yet, for a life that wasn't his to carry, but he carried it anyway. The silence was deafening. In the back row, the sheriff crossed his arms, watching the room shift like a field of wheat in wind. One by one, people began to bow their heads, not in shame, but in something softer. The preacher cleared his throat. "You've said your piece, Miss Eliza." "No," she said. "I've only started. Because if you hang that man, you hang the last decent thing this town's seen in a long time." It wasn't a plea. It was a reckoning. Outside, the jail bell rang once. The rider who had brought the truth had returned, with more papers, signed and sealed, proving her innocence, proving the bounty false. But the sheriff didn't read them right away. Instead, he stood in the doorway of the chapel and waited as the townspeople turned toward him, not for justice, but for a sign. "She spoke," he said. "So now it's our turn to act." And in that moment, something shifted, not just in law, but in heart. Because a town that had once looked the other way had finally been forced to look inward. And it was a girl barely 5 feet tall who made them do it. The jail cell sat quiet, but he knew before the door opened that someone had come. The Lakota giant didn't stir when the key turned or when the sheriff stepped in. He simply kept his gaze fixed on the narrow window where a sliver of moonlight bled across the floor. It wasn't bars that held him. It was principle. When the sheriff placed the documents on the table, the prisoner didn't even glance at them. "You're free to go," the sheriff said flatly. "Town council saw the papers. The bounty's fake. The charges won't hold." Still, the man didn't move. "She spoke for you," the sheriff added, this time with less certainty. They listened. Only then did the Lakota giant lift his eyes, steady and unreadable. And will they listen next time? The sheriff shifted. "I don't know, but today, they did." The man stood, his full height almost brushing the beams overhead. The shackles had already been unlocked, but he hadn't shed them. "Then I walk out only after she walks in." Confused, the sheriff opened the door fully. And there she was. Eliza stepped in, her chin high but her hands trembling slightly as she crossed the room. "They offered me a cabin," she said, forcing a smile. "Said I could stay at the edge of town. Alone." The Lakota man didn't speak, but something in his posture changed, shoulders lowering just a bit, eyes softening. "But I told them I'd rather be where the ground was shared," she continued, "so I came to ask if you'd walk with me. Not as a debt, not as a rescue. Just walk beside me." He reached down and removed the cuffs from his wrists, setting them on the bench. "Then we leave together." As they stepped into the night, a few lanterns lit windows. No crowds, no noise, just quiet acknowledgement. The baker tipped his hat from his porch. A child waved from behind a curtain. Even the sheriff, arms crossed, gave a slow nod. But the most surprising thing waited at the edge of the road. The same preacher who once flinched at her presence, now holding 2 loaves of bread in outstretched hands. "To start a table," he murmured. The Lakota man took one. Eliza took the other, and together they walked toward the eastern ridge, not to escape, but to build. Behind them, the town remained still, the weight of silence not from shame, but from a long overdue peace that had begun not with a war, but with a woman's voice, a giant's choice, and a door left open. The cabin wasn't much. 2 rooms, an uneven roof, and a pump that hissed before giving water. But it was theirs. Built by men who never returned, inherited by no one, claimed by a silence the Lakota man understood better than most. He didn't say much those first mornings. He dug post holes while she patched the fence. He chopped wood. She carried it. They moved in tandem, not out of plan but rhythm, like 2 hands that hadn't known they'd been reaching until they finally met. When a wagon broke an axle on the road, it was Eliza who stepped forward with a jack. When a stranger rode too close one dusk, it was the Lakota who stepped silently between her and the rifle. The town watched from a distance, unsure what to make of it. This widow with no mourning veil, this warrior with no war. But on the 7th day, something shifted. A girl wandered from town, chasing a loose lamb, and when the child didn't return, bells rang from the chapel, and boots hit dirt. By the time searchers reached the woods, they found the child already lifted onto the shoulders of the Lakota, his hand steady as the girl cried into his neck. Eliza held the lamb, bruised but alive. "You let her into your home?" one of the men asked, eyeing Eliza with suspicion. "I let her drink," she answered, "from the same bucket I use." Another muttered, "Not sure what's worse, that you'd trust him or that you'd let her near you." The Lakota set the child down gently. "She walked where no one else would," he said, voice low. "The child saw that, do you?" There was silence. Thick, uncomfortable. Then the baker's boy stepped forward with a sack of flour. "Ma said if you're baking, you'll need this." A woman placed eggs near the door. One by one, offerings came. Not words, not apologies, but things that mattered when fences break and bellies growl. No one said they were sorry. No one said they were wrong. But by nightfall, the cabin's table was full, and when the preacher knocked with a Bible and 2 chipped cups, Eliza looked to the Lakota man, who nodded once. "He stays if you do," she said firmly. The preacher hesitated, then sat. That night, the 3 of them ate in silence, broken only by a faint laugh when Eliza spilled stew on her apron and the Lakota handed her his own cloth without a word. It was not forgiveness in speeches or justice in courts. It was peace made in shared stew, in tools passed without question, in the quiet dignity of labor side by side. And in that small cabin by the ridge, 2 souls who once walked alone began the strange, wordless work of becoming one. By mid-morning, the town buzzed with new tension. A wagon had overturned outside the schoolhouse, injuring the mayor's son, and whispers spread that Eliza was the one who startled the horses. No proof, just suspicion. But in Redemption Hollow, suspicion weighed heavier than truth. The sheriff arrived with his boots still dusted from sleep, eyes flicking from the broken axle to the widow's pale face. "They say you ran out screaming," he said quietly. Eliza shook her head. "I wasn't even near the road." A few townsfolk began to gather, circling like hawks who smelled fear. That's when the Lakota man stepped forward. "It was me," he said simply. "I crossed too fast. Spooked the horses." Silence wrapped the street like fog. The sheriff studied him. "You sure?" "I am." "Then you'll pay for the axle and the bruised boy's pride." He nodded once. "I will." Eliza opened her mouth, but he gave the slightest shake of his head. "Not yet. Not here. She watched him as he knelt beside the broken wheel, lifting it as if it weighed no more than a sack of grain. The mayor's wife, a stiff woman with pearls and judgment in her eyes, watched him carefully. Then she did something no one expected. She turned to Eliza and said, "You better check that lamb's leg again, dear. I saw it limping." It was small, quiet, but it was mercy. The crowd began to scatter. The sheriff muttered, "We'll call it square if the wagon runs again." Eliza waited until dusk to speak. They stood beside the well, the air thick with heat and dust. "You shouldn't have lied," she said. He didn't look at her. "You shouldn't have been blamed." "You're not the kind of man who kneels," she said. "Not unless it's for someone who matters." He turned to her then, eyes steady, jaw clenched with something deeper than pain. "You matter." For a long moment, she said nothing. Then she reached for his hand, not to hold it, but to press a bandage into it. His palm was torn from the wheel. "You bled for a lie," she said. "Let me dress it in truth." They didn't speak after that. Not as the sun sank, not as the crickets stirred, not as they sat side by side on the cabin step and watched the quiet settle like fog on the road. But something had shifted. Not the town, not the law, but them. And sometimes, that was the only place worth saving first. It began with a bell. The church bell rang at noon, as always, but this time no hymn followed. Just silence, and then murmurs. Because word had spread that Eliza was to be questioned at the town meeting, not formally charged, but brought in front of everyone to clarify the wagon incident. She wore her mother's faded shawl and carried no lawyer, no man, no defense. Just a folded piece of paper in her apron, the deed to her tiny bakery, unpaid taxes circled in red. She walked alone. But when she reached the square, he was already there. The Lakota man stood beside the water trough, arms folded, hat low, boots planted like the roots of a tree no storm could bend. A few whispered, a few glared. One boy spit near his feet, but he didn't flinch. The mayor cleared his throat. "Eliza, we only want clarity. A child was nearly trampled." "That's serious." She opened her mouth. "She wasn't even there," the Lakota man said, his voice calm but loud enough to halt birds in flight. "I already confessed." "You were cleared," the sheriff said, "but folks have a right to ask." "Then ask me, not her." A murmur rippled. "Why do you care?" the pastor's wife asked sharply. "Because this town draws lines with whispers, and you think silence means guilt. I won't let her stand alone while you decide what her quiet means." Eliza stepped closer, her hands trembling. "You don't have to do this." "Neither do you," he replied, "but you keep showing up anyway." A rancher stepped forward. "He fixed my wagon 2 winters back. Wouldn't take coin." A young mother added, "He carried my boy when his fever broke, walked 3 miles." One by one, people began to speak. Not loud, not many, but enough. The pastor's wife frowned but said nothing. The sheriff finally sighed. "No law broken, no charges filed. We're done here." Eliza exhaled shakily, but just as she turned to leave, a voice called out, "You trust him?" It was the blacksmith, his arms folded, eyes like flint. Eliza didn't look away. "I do." "Even after what they say about his past?" She nodded. "Because of what I've seen since." The Lakota man didn't smile, but he stood taller. That night, the bakery stayed open late. 2 candles glowed in the window, and a loaf of bread sat cooling on the sill. He passed by, nodded once, and kept walking. But she knew he'd heard her, and so did the town. 3 days passed, and the town returned to its shallow rhythm, brooms brushing wooden porches, pie smoke curling from cafe chimneys, gossip like prairie wind slipping through fences. Eliza worked quietly, lips chapped, eyes tired, but her back straight as ever. Most smiled now when they passed her, some out of guilt, some out of genuine shift. But no one asked how she slept. Not until she walked out that Sunday and saw him again. Not in the alley, not by the trough, but in front of the courthouse where no Lakota man had stood welcome since its foundation. The preacher's son stood beside him, tall and nervous. Behind them, 3 riders dismounted, railroad men, city-slicked and pale. Eliza felt her breath catch. She'd heard whispers, land sales, annex plans, new routes cutting through town. The courthouse had always been safe from it, until now. The sheriff stepped out. "We'll take it to vote. County says survey crews can begin after frost." "That land was promised," said the Lakota giant, calm but firm. "And the deed never signed." The preacher's son nodded. "It's in the records, page 17. My father wrote it by hand." "That promise don't hold," one railman laughed. "You got no voice in a town like this." Eliza didn't plan to speak, but something rose in her chest, like when heat boils under calm. She stepped forward. "He does now?" Everyone turned. "You're a baker," said the railman. "You don't get a vote?" "Then strike my vote, but you'll still hear my voice." She turned to the townsfolk gathering. "He took blame to spare me. Some of you called it noble. If so, then listen when he speaks. Or else admit you only honor a man's silence, not his truth." A hush fell. The mayor frowned. "There's no law against surveys." "No," said Eliza. "But there's no law stopping us from standing in the way, either." "You'd stand for him?" a woman asked. "Even now?" "Especially now," she said, her voice steady. Then she looked at the Lakota man, eyes meeting his. "Because you stood for me when it counted." His mouth parted barely. He hadn't asked for this. But the way she said it, his name, without shame, without whisper, full and clear into the sun-drenched air, made something shift. The preacher's son grinned. "You all heard it?" She called him family. The sheriff looked around. "You'd have to cross all of us to move that survey." The railmen scowled and backed down. The Lakota man didn't smile, but he nodded once toward her. Eliza felt the wind warm her face. For the first time since she arrived, she didn't feel small. Just seen, spring arrived with no announcement, just a soft shift in air, a greener tint to the hills, and the sound of boots not hurried but steady. Eliza stood outside the bakery porch, her apron dusted with flour, her hair braided down her back in calm loops. Inside, warm loaves cooled near the window. But it wasn't bread that drew the crowd today. It was the benches arranged near the town square, the folding chairs, the strange hush in a place once used to shouts. Someone had brought a violin, and though the man played poorly, the tune curled through the morning like something old and sacred. Near the oak tree, where they'd once posted blame and shame, the Lakota giant stood with his back to the sun, his hair tied in ceremonial leather, his shirt buttoned clean. No chains on his wrists, no threats in his shadow. Just presence. Eliza stepped toward him, holding a tin cup of cool water. "You nervous?" she asked, handing it over. "No," he said, voice low. "You?" "Terrified," she said, then smiled. "But I'm still standing." He looked around, not at the crowd, but at the quiet behind their eyes. He had always known what it meant to carry silence. Today, she carried it with him. The preacher's son stepped forward, holding the town book of records. "We gather," he said, "to acknowledge not just a correction, but a start. This town owes its peace not to comfort, but to courage. And that courage came from a man who took blame, and a woman who told the truth." There were nods, unsure at first, then firmer. The sheriff tipped his hat. The mayor bowed his head. The children clapped like it was a fair. And Eliza, without prompting, reached for the Lakota man's hand, not to own it, but to show it belonged here. He didn't pull back. Instead, he looked at the horizon, where the ridges met the sky. "Will you stay?" she asked softly. "There's space in the bakery now. It's not much." "It's enough," he said. "If it's peace." She nodded. "Then it's yours too." They didn't speak vows. They didn't sign anything. But when he turned to face the square, hand still in hers, the whole town knew what had been written without ink. Not a marriage, not a pardon, but something holier. Two lives once accused by others, now redeemed by each other. The violin played louder. Children laughed. And for once, the square echoed not with punishment, but welcome. The Lakota giant let the sun warm his brow. The tiny bride stood tall beside him. And the land beneath their feet, once split by silence, held steady, as if it had always waited for this moment. Because sometimes the one who takes the blame is the only one brave enough to carry peace. Please like, share, and subscribe to support more true-hearted stories on Stories Left Behind. If you had been in that dusty town square, would you have stood beside the Lakota giant or watched in silence? Tell us in the comments. Every view, every voice, every heart matters here. We tell stories of justice, quiet love, and the kind of courage that history almost forgot. Thank you for being part of it.